Hello, everyone. So our topic today is reducing barriers to regulation in the Kalimantan palm oil industry, and we've chosen to address this from the aspect of governance and addressing how Indonesian and the Kalimantan governments can both better regulate the environmental, labor, and economic issues associated with the palm oil industry.
The Round Top of Sustainable Oil, otherwise known as the RSPO, was established in 2004 as a way to check the palm industry and gave a set of criteria that was meant to promote sustainability and lessen the environmental impact for harvesting. However, instead it was met with critiques that render it ineffective, critiques like it didn't enact change or results took too long to appear. It didn't secure indigenous land, and reports found that they tend to violate their own policies by colluding with companies they were meant to regulate. In reference to the Indonesian Sustainable Palm Oil, ISPO, which was enacted through the Ministry of Agriculture, it failed for some of the similar reasons. The majority of the critiques focus on how the ISPO failed the indigenous community by also not securing the land from palm oil plantations for indigenous people, but also by creating a framework to officiate land claim that was too bureaucratic of a filing system, and it didn't actually recognize the land claims. The overarching similarity between the RSPO and ISPO is that it was voluntary and had no enforcement. Historically, we've seen this happen with the Kyoto Agreement in reference to climate change, and yet these issues still seem to prevail. The omnibus law is something we found that was passed in October 2020. It is a 1,000 plus page long law that overarches job creation, taxation, labor reform, and regulations relating to new capital building being moved to East Kalimantan. During the drafting process, which was in the height of the COVID pandemic, hundreds of thousands of protested the new law for it seeming to go back in time. By this, I'll refer to the re-centralization of government, thus taking back power from the subnational or local governments while reintroducing a militarized presence. The Indonesian president looks to give the economy a jumpstart from the effects of the pandemic by making it easier for foreign businesses to attain licensing and foster entrepreneurship, all the while increasing economic growth. However, it has many regulatory and restricting frameworks for workers' rights and environmental protections.
The organization that we decided to work under is the Ministry of Agriculture. The ministry is a governmental department which oversees agricultural development. It is headed by the Coordinating Minister of Economic Affairs, which executes tasks assigned by the President. Some of its mission objectives include achieving an efficient, sustainable system for agriculture, promoting honest and fair business partnerships, improving the quality of government performance, and assisting farmers with the development of innovative methods to be competitive players in the market. Some of its central functions include the formulation of agribusiness and economic policies, the protection of biodiversity, and the management of state property. These are some of the policies that we propose to implement, and after seeing that the ministry had jurisdiction over these functions, we believe that it would be the best organization to approach the question with. The objective for our policy is to create a regulatory system that evaluates environmental and labor protection and systemic corruption, which are the criteria outlined in our policy proposal, and the region that we plan to implement this in is East Kalimantan. According to the statistics presented in the case, East Kalimantan is the area with the highest unemployment and lowest labor force participation rates and has one of the highest poverty rates. For this reason, we thought it would be best to do a pilot implementation of our policy, and if we saw positive change, we would expand the policy into the other provinces. In order to achieve this, we propose a model centered around economic incentives. Through this model, we suggest an imposition of fines for violations of the criteria and tax breaks for compliance, thus motivating companies to act in accordance with mandated laws. The fines would depend on a variety of factors, including the severity of the violation. As for compliant parties, we would implement a tax break, and this would serve as a further motivator for companies and smallholder farmers to comply with policy. This would be done in tandem with the Ministry of Finance. In order to uphold the system, we would rely on a committee of inspectors that are designated by the Ministry of Agriculture. There would be two sets of groups conducting inspections to ensure company compliance, and the first group would comprised of local peoples, including activists, indigenous peoples, and general community members, which conduct quarterly inspections. Through trainings would assist with unemployed members of society with job acquisition, and the second group would be comprised of ministry officials who conduct annual inspections to ensure federal oversight and anti-corruption.
So our environmental protection plan. Due to the nature of the omnibus law, we couldn't legally implement and enforce our policies. In regards to this confounding variable, we determined that using the emission reduction payment agreement through the Indonesian government and the World Bank as an umbrella for us to implement our policies would potentially work. So the ERPA says that the Indonesian government will receive $110 million from the carbon fund contingent upon Indonesian carbon emission reduction of 22 million tons between the years 2019 and 2024. In this case, the Ministry of Agriculture would work under this umbrella in the sense that our environmental policies are devoted to cutting back deforestation, which would help reduce the carbon emissions. Therefore, our policies still fall under the omnibus law signed by the executive branch, while also being covered by executive signing from the World Bank for this agreement. The way our policies work to cut back on deforestation is by allocating land to indigenous peoples. In 2013, the Indonesian Constitutional Court ruled that the government has the constitutional right to allocate land privileges to indigenous people, and we would enforce this land claim through our Economic Incentives Initiative. This dedication of land then assists with the environmental protection through ensuring protections for biodiversity, a reduction in deforestation, and projected environmental sustainability in comparison to lands under the control of corporations.
In addition to the economic incentive model, we've also placed into effect several anti-corruption counters designated to target regulators who are designated by the Ministry of Agriculture. This includes the establishment of an anti-corruption task force under the Ministry of Agriculture, but also addressing actionable measures such as, addressing actionable measures such as having different civil society members forming regulatory commission that performs inspections on corporations and plantations, but also government oversight over inspectors to ensure that they're not bought off, including tax documentation and asset review for inspectors. And the consequences of lying about an inspection for the benefit of a corporation include penalization of the corporation financially, as well as possible jail time for inspectors, depending on the severity of corruption. We've also worked to ensure that labor rights are protected under this regulatory commission. So one of the issues that had prevailed in the past was that corporations were not registering all of their employees, which then meant that employees were not entitled to social services typically provided by Indonesian law. As such, all employees must be officially registered to ensure workers receive identification cards entitling them to workers' rights and benefits. And then we've also outlined several other categories aligning with child labor laws, as well as maximum workday laws and so on. And finally, a minimum wage standard compliant with that of the federal minimum wage of Indonesia, which is currently at 1,027 USD, which thereby targets the Kalimantan poverty rate. In terms of the actual economic incentive application here, corporations and smallholder farmers are to initially be educated, given a 3-month grace period, and then be subject to quarterly inspections on facilities in terms of the first year application. And so the way that this kind of works in sort of a timeline frame is on the first month, we are introducing a citizens assembly based on the Irish example of educating on policy, which includes educational sessions for corporations and smallholder farmers to inform of new policy, educate on standards and manners of implementation. The first local inspection will occur at the end of month 3, and violators are not penalized at this time, but instead re-educated. Resources are also allocated from the budget to assisting smallholder farmers to meeting thresholds for regulatory changes. At the end of the 6th month, the second local inspection occurs, and violators are now penalized proportional to violations and accounting for size and capacity of the corporation. As with respect to smallholder farmers, we continue to provide smallholder farmers with access to consultation resources and reduce any forms of penalization to ensure that they are not penalized for their poverty, but rather instead encouraged to practice sustainable practices. The final local inspection of the year also coincides with a national inspection, where violators are again penalized proportional to violations. Finally, at the end of the 12th month, we evaluate the policy on several success metrics, including money accrued from fines and evaluating the reach of social welfare and so on. And this also occurs in consultation with civil society groups and environmental groups and activists to ensure that our policies are sustainable in the long term and integrate the local community as well.
So when we're looking at budget allocation, we're working within the constraints of the Ministry of Agriculture's overall budget for the year, which was $1.5 billion. But we used the population of Kalimantan, specifically East Kalimantan, which this project will be based in order to get a representative budget allocation. So we got this number, which is about $20 million US. So what we did after that is to equally divide that between human resources and educational resources. The number of inspectors will be decided on a local level through the use of citizens' assemblies, since we want to encourage a broad representation of residents of East Kalimantan. However, the Ministry of Agriculture will be assessing specific budgets based on the needs that local governments provide us with, and while working with citizens' assemblies. This will be cutting down this will be cutting down on exponential growth in the sector. However, we will be ensuring that there's sustainable source of income in the long run. Instead of focusing on like short-term gains and experiencing losses in the long term, we aim to increase the long-term net outcome.
Sorry to interrupt, but that is your 10-minute time. So I'm going to begin the 5-minute judging question section now.
Can I just clarify, can we go back to the budget slide? Is this your proposed budget for this specific policy activity objective, or is this the budget that already exists within the Ministry of Agriculture?
Our proposed budget allocation.
Okay.
I have a question. I really like the idea of tapping into the carbon fund and mobilizing carbon emission reductions as kind of a way to achieve these objectives. So how specifically will you validate carbon emissions reductions to deliver them under the IRBA?
So one of the measures that we have kind of talked about in terms of evaluating success measures, especially on the environmental perspective, has been we're engaging with civil society groups that already work on evaluating environmental measures. So for instance, there is a group called Sawit Watch that actively engages with the Indonesian government in terms of environmental matters, and specifically with sustainable farming, as well as actively evaluates measures such as carbon emission standards and deforestation rates. And so collaboration with these groups kind of gives us a metric for where we are in terms of progression on sustainability, and then reevaluating our policy on a yearly basis to ensure that we are developing actionable metrics that continue to reduce carbon emissions.
Yeah, I guess I'm wondering what specific practices you'll do to generate emissions reduction. So would it be like red projects, real estate, like reduced emissions from avoided deforestation and degradation, which are often community-based projects, or reduced impact logging that generates carbon credits. But if you haven't, if you haven't gotten that far in terms of specific, that's okay. I was just kind of wondering if that was something you thought about.
No, unfortunately, we didn't go that deep into addressing.
That's okay. it's kind of, I guess it's a little bit in the weeds, but appreciate it.
I had a quick question about, I really like the idea of, creating that initial education piece during the pilot program. You did mention that, after the 3-month and the 6-month period or after the third 3-month period, if they fail an inspection, that they would be re-educated. And then after the 6-month period, if they failed an inspection, they would be given consultative resources. Who pays for that consultative resource? Is it up to the farmer to pay for that, or is that something that would be given to them as part of this pilot program?
Will be part of the pilot program. We accounted for that within our budget. We're trying to make it as accessible for the farmers as possible. Yeah.
Okay.
Could you talk a little bit about how you see other stakeholders engaged in this? So, I mean, I understand you're the Ministry of Agriculture, so this is focused on kind of the role that the Ministry of Agriculture will play in this, but how do you see, NGOs and kind of other actors in the industry participating in this process?
So we mentioned the Citizens Assembly. So what we want to do with that is make sure that we're not only coming a top-down approach, but we're engaging the communities in this conversation, particularly basically all stakeholders, meaning indigenous groups, smallholder farmers, as well as corporations and other civil society members. And making them part of the decision-making process. And eventually, towards the end, we want them to be part of the feedback so that we can reassess our direction for the next year.
You have 30 seconds if you'd like to use it to finish your presentation or anything.
One of the points that we had skipped over just in terms of labor and as well as policies or programs that we do want to implement is that money from the fines that we are taking from corporations are going to be redirected to invest in Kalimantan civil society by creating an unemployment to work education program in conjunction with the pre-employment card program through the Ministry of Manpower and Transmigration. And so this involves, for example, unskilled and unemployed workers being trained for a possible duration that may include 3 to 6 months in various jobs in the palm oil industry, which creates a better pipeline to jobs and reducing unemployment within the Kalimantan region.
Okay, thank you so much, Policy for Change. Thank you so much for your presentation. If you all will hop off the Zoom room, I'll give the judges their 5-minute deliberation time. Thank you so much.
Nice job, ladies.
And great work.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.